This video will describe the beginnings of a settlement at the head of Lake Ontario. Quickly finds that the first 4 Britishers to settle on the south shore of the bay of now called Hamilton Harbour, on land that is now part of the city of Hamilton. The 4 Britishers that settled the area were Richard Beasley, Robert Land, Charles Depew, and George Stewart. That was within a few years, more or less, of 1782. In point of interest, the romantic story of Robert Land and his family is outstanding, and the purpose of this video is to relate some of the main traditions and associations that concern them. Robert Land, the progenitor of the family, was born in 1739 at Tiverton, Devonshire, England. His father, John Samuel Land Sr., was 42 and his mother, Dorothy Tye, was 42. Land emigrated as a young man to British colonial America, possibly with a twin brother John. There is no information to attest to this fact. He settled near Calkins Creek at what is now Melansville, in the Delaware Valley, Pennsylvania. There he built a log cabin. He was short, stout and fair, and was naturally attracted to a girl who was tall and dark, in the person of Phoebe Scott, 3 years older than himself, whom he married around the year 1756 in New York, British colonial America. As a settler and farmer he succeeded very well, and by 1776, when the American Revolution broke out, he was well established. At the age of 40, as a justice of the peace of Pennsylvania, he had a house and family of 7 girls and boys. They ranged from a baby of a few months old to John, aged 19. About this time, his loyalty caused him to take service with the British forces. Because of his knowledge of the country, Land joined Joseph Brant's volunteers as a courier, scout and loyalist recruiter. He was selected to carry dispatches far and wide. Meanwhile his family and others like them suffered abuse for their loyalty to King George III. When the father was away, a raid on his household was made by hostile neighbors and Indians. One of the sons, Abel, was taken away by the Indians. His brother John found where the Indians had gone and persuaded them to release Abel, but not until the captive had been made to run the gauntlet of their blows. This was an Indian tradition where the entire Indian village created 2 lines armed with clubs and tomahawks, and the unfortunate person had to run the length of the gauntlet. Abel made it through the gauntlet alive, as he was fleet-footed or just plain lucky. Persecution continued, and soon after this John himself was put in prison by the rebel authorities, and the mother and the rest were left to carry on the work of the farm short-handed. One night in the autumn of 1778, when the family had retired to sleep, a daughter, Rebecca, or perhaps Kate, was aroused from her sleep by the hand and voice of a friendly Indian, who urged her to go at once to the Canes, their loyalist neighbor, across the river. Without disturbing the others she dressed, crossed the water alone in a canoe, and entered their darkened house. Here she stumbled over the bodies of the Canes. They had all been foully murdered. As the courageous girl returned home, the same Indian's voice warned her that her house would soon be burned and that the others should be got out at once. Hastily but quietly the girl awakened her mother and the rest of the family. They all escaped to the fields, and just in time, for presently on looking back they beheld their house and barn in flames. For some days the family hid in the woods, then under much physical hardship they made their way to New York and came under the protection of the British authorities. They stayed there until the army evacuated the city. They and many other loyalists in a similar plight were taken to what is now New Brunswick, where they remained for 7 years. Some time after the departure of his family from their farmhouse, Robert Land chanced to be in the vicinity and unobtrusively paid it a visit, only to find the ashes of his home and no trace of his dear ones. The few loyalist neighbors to whom he dared reveal himself told of the murder of the Cane family, and quite believed that Mrs. Land and the children had also perished. In 1779 he was captured by rebel militia and brought before a military court in Minnesink, New York. He was charged with spying for the British. He was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging, but his conviction was overturned by General George Washington on the grounds that as an inhabitant of one of the states, Land was not subject to the jurisdiction of a military court. Land was released on bail to await his new trial, but he jumped bail. The despairing man then decided to leave the country where he had lost so much and endured such injustice. A Quaker friend named Ralph Morden undertook to guide him to the Niagara border, but word of Land's presence had spread around and they were pursued by a group of watchful rebels. Land started off and urged his companion to hasten, but Ralph Morden, who in accordance with the peaceful ways of his Quaker sect had never taken up arms nor done any ill, Ralph Morden was confident that he could convince their pursuers of his innocence. Such an argument, however, counted for nothing with the inflamed mob. Ralph Morden was seized, and was subsequently condemned and hanged. As Land outdistanced those who followed him, they fired after him and had the satisfaction of seeing him fall among the underbrush. The heavy musket ball struck Robert's knapsack with force enough to knock him down. As he fell, his hand was gashed on a sharp stone, and bled profusely. This marked a trail which his enemies followed and at last gave up, for darkness was falling. They concluded that he was as good as dead. Traveling chiefly by night, Land reached Fort Niagara and found safety with the British there. This was in 1779, at the age of 43. When the war ended, Land received a Loyalist grant of 200 acres, now covered by the town of Niagara Falls, Ontario. Their loyalty to King George III entitled them to petition for a free land grant. The facts in the petition had to be proven and he was allocated acreage in size depending on the rank held in the Revolution by the individual who was applying for such grant. There he lived alone for 3 years, morose and brooding over his unkindly fate, within earshot of the falls, whose noise disturbed the peace of mind that he sought. When he could bear it no longer, something prompted him to move 50 miles away to the neighborhood of what we now call Burlington Bay. From the escarpment he followed a deer trail leading down to the water. Well back from the marshy and indented shoreline, on a slight rise of ground, now the south side of Barton Street, between Leeming Street and Smith Avenue, he made himself a dugout, according to family story, in which he lived until he had built a shanty or log cabin. As a Loyalist he petitioned for land and on May 3, 1791, he was assigned Lot 11 on the 3rd concession of the township of Barton containing 100 acres. He farmed, hunted and fished and grew the area's first wheat. He set about clearing some land, and supported himself after the manner of woodsmen by hunting, fishing and trapping. He was still in solitude, for white neighbors were far and few. He sought forgetfulness and peace in unremitting toil amid primitive surroundings. When the War of Independence was over, the eldest son, John Land, was released from confinement. As he had not taken up arms, he was allowed to own and occupy family property in the Delaware Valley. Later he built the Red House, which still stands there in Milonville. He married Lillian Skinner and was the father of 11 children and progenitor of the American branch of the family. Though some of his descendants live on the farm and in its vicinity, the family name of Land has died out. Robert, the youngest son, whom we shall now have to designate as Robert II, appears to have grown dissatisfied with the conditions in New Brunswick, where ill fortune continued to dog the family. While he was but 17, he urged and finally persuaded his mother to migrate with some if not all of them to Upper Canada, now known as Ontario, where settlers of the right class and in particular Loyalists, were being encouraged. So they took ship to New York on the first part of the long journey to Niagara and visited John at his farmstead on the way. From him they heard the tale of Ralph Morden's untimely hanging. The popular report sustained the reputed death of their father Robert Land Sr. John was quite satisfied with his own prospects and was not disposed to leave his setting. With affection and regret the family separated and the emigrants slowly made their way to Niagara, where the boys supported the group by hunting and trapping and occasionally working for neighboring settlers. After they had been there a year or so they chanced to hear through an itinerant trader that a settler named Robert Land was living alone at the head of the lake, as the western end of Lake Ontario was then called. Despite the unlikelihood that this could ever be a kinsman of theirs, unless he came from the old country, Robert Land II decided to go and find out. Mrs. Land was not thoroughly convinced that her husband had been killed. She became hopefully anxious about the matter, and it was agreed that some of them should make the 50-mile journey. Eventually, she and 2 sons, Robert and Ephraim, came to the trail that led to Journey's End, a clearing with a solitary cabin, outside of which the long-lost father was sitting smoking. The joyful family reunion after 11 years of separation was as a dream come true. Later they were joined by 2 other sons and 3 daughters. With thankful hearts the united family set to work once more as diligent farmers, and in a few years they were all beyond the reach of want. Other settlers began to come in, but many were deterred by the name the place had for its marshiness, for wolves and rattlesnakes, and the Indian grass that was so difficult to eradicate. It is recorded that when neighbors were more numerous, Robert supported himself in part by making and selling spinning jennies. Robert Land, the father, commemorated his years of sorrow and happy outcome by planting a weeping willow near the cabin. In time the humble dwelling was replaced by a substantial house which was called Land Home. In 1794 he applied for a grant of land, and by a deed dated 1802 was allowed 312 acres, stretching from the mountain to the bay and from Emerald to Wentworth streets. Each of his sons, Abel, William, Ephraim, and Robert, acquired 200 acres on adjoining lots. On this area of over a square mile of virgin prairie-like land, intersected by long marshy inlets from the bay, Robert's granted land now stands as the central part of the city of Hamilton. Abel, Ephraim and Robert stayed in this locality, but William, the other son, moved west to Oxford County. Robert the Elder lived to see the beginnings of Hamilton as a village, and died in 1818, aged 82. He was buried in Hamilton Cemetery, Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Phoebe his wife died in 1826, aged 93. In his will, dated October 27, 1805, Robert did give and bequeath to each of his sons John and Abel the sum of 20 shillings. To his daughters, Rebecca, wife of Nathaniel Hewson, and Phoebe Jr., wife of Clement Lucas, 20 shillings each. To another daughter, Abigail, wife of Uzziah McCarty, 20 shillings also, which several legacies were to be paid by his executors within 1 year of his decease. To his son Ephraim he bequeathed 150 acres of the farm, and to Robert 162 acres. Hard money was evidently scarce in those days, like that of the biblical patriarchs whose wealth consisted of herds of cattle. The substance of the pioneer lay in real estate, which is solid property rather than coin of the realm, and that agricultural wealth could only be increased by hard manual labor under living conditions comprising an assortment of physical discomforts that would appall us today. United Empire Loyalists like Robert Land and his family have played a noble part in our Canadian history. By their sacrifices and sufferings for their principles they founded 2 of our provinces and leavened with their strength the 3 already colonized. In such pioneer stock Ontario has indeed a noble parentage, which we may well cherish with affection and pride. Robert Land Sr. was a respected man loyal to the British Empire. There is a plaque commemorating his accomplishments in the city of Hamilton at the corner of Barton Street East and Sanford Avenue. The marker is in Woodland Park. Thank you for watching this video and learning the history of Robert Land Sr. and how he was the father of Hamilton, Ontario.